Imagine having an entire universe inside your mind designed to help you remember information, make connections that lead to new insights, and even provide solace when times get tough, as they inevitably do. Well, that's just part of the vision of the great memory master Giordano Bruno, and it's the vision he had for people just like you. And Scott Gosnell has worked tirelessly for many years now on translating Bruno's memory books so that you can build your own inner universe of precious memories that help you navigate the exterior world, especially when it gets tough, or so that you can be prepared for when it gets tough. Because, as we know, you gotta make hay when the sun shines. Now, when Scott's translation of Bruno's De Umbra Siderum, or On the Shadows of Ideas, first arrived, there was much excitement around the world because for the first time we could read this powerful text in English. And now, as part of celebrating an update to the text and 2 special hardback editions, Scott has launched a Kickstarter campaign to fund the initiative and allow him to bring you a complete course on Bruno's methods. If you'd like to support the campaign and get a hardcover edition of Scott's translation, just visit magneticmerrymethod.com/SG. That link will take you over to the Kickstarter page, and of course, when you follow Scott on Twitter, you'll get updates on the campaign. And of course, you can just search for it on Kickstarter. Now, I can't underemphasize the value of what Scott has done, and I can't wait personally for the course he's putting together to go with this new edition. Learning Bruno has been for me something to visit and revisit because it's so interesting, so powerful, so impactful, and quite frankly, it's challenging. And because it's challenging, the rewards when you apply his ideas to your own memory techniques and how you use them, they're so much higher. And by the same token, it would have been so much easier and faster if there had been not only a course, but all of Scott's Bruno translations available all at once, rather than having to wait, as I did, year after year for them to come out. And that's why it's so cool that when you support Scott's initiative at the college collection level, you're getting all of those other translations as part of the package. So, a stack of the most important memory training books the world has ever seen and a course to go with them? You're in for a real treat, magnetic friends. And to make this treat even sweeter, let's dive into this discussion with Scott himself about the project, the translation, and more of those granular details that go into the technical aspects of the philosophy and the memory techniques of Giordano Bruno. Scott, thank you so much for joining me again on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast. It's so good to see you.
Hey, good to see you again, Anthony.
Well, you're probably, if memory serves, the most frequent person to appear in repeat episodes and so forth. And today we have a special occasion because you're bringing out a new version of one of your Bruno translations. So for people who don't know you, although that would be a surprise for people who've followed this for a while, just bring us up to speed on who you are, who this Bruno character is, the translations, and why more Bruno now at this time.
Sure. Well, I'm a former neuroscience researcher, former business consultant specializing in startups and early stage companies and innovation within larger companies. And about 10 years ago, I started getting interested in Giordano Bruno, who I'd read about through John Crowley's Egypt novels. And then from him, I found Francis Yates's Art of Memory and Giordano Bruno and the Rosicrucian Enlightenment and the rest of her books. And one of the things that I found in those books was that even though there were these tantalizing little snippets of translated Bruno on the Memory Palace and on the Art of Memory, there was no English translation of most of his work. People had done his cosmological work in the Italian, but none of the Latin works almost. One or two, a couple of the essays on magic, a couple of things here and there. But, I kept looking around for someone who would be able to do a Latin translation and take on the project, and no one seemed willing or interested. So eventually, if no one else is interested and you're looking for a volunteer, eventually you volunteered.
Right.
So, right. So, because that's the only way to do things. And if you don't know how to do something, the only thing to do is learn how to do it. And so, kind of piece by piece, I learned Latin from, I had already had a little bit from, church choir and scientific Latin and things like that, but kind of sat there with a dictionary on my lap and construed Latin sentences for, a couple hundred pages. And, went back and edited it and figured out that I had an okay translation, went out and tried to get picked up by an academic publication. And they sort of said, well, you're not really in the academy in the way that we like to see people there. This hasn't been reviewed by the right people. So, I don't know. And then, the other one said, well, we have a lot of projects on our plate, or we don't have the funding for additional volumes. And so I ended up self-publishing it through Amazon, which turned out to be a great success and a great idea because it has been selling steadily ever since. And it's been almost 10 years now.
Right.
And then this year, because it's been selling so well, and because people kept asking for the kind of fancy versions, hardback versions with the elegant bindings, I decided to try and do a Kickstarter that would sell, the best kind of bookmaking that you could imagine, with no compromises whatsoever. So I have one that's bound in sort of a beautiful dark blue shantung silk cover and gold stamping and everything. And then there'll also be a super duper fancy version in the deluxe with white leather. And so it's designed to resemble one of the first editions that Bruno ever put out. So we're going to see how that goes, and hopefully it'll be really successful, and a lot of people will like to buy it.
It's either faded from my memory or I didn't know it in the first place, but I don't remember you mentioning that there was an attempt to get a traditional publisher for this. And, knowing that just makes me wonder a little bit more about the conditions under which Bruno published in the first place. Because in my imagination and just general understanding, it seems like he also had to bootstrap, take some initiative. There's some indication, I think I read from you, that he did his own woodcuts and so forth to get.
Yeah, so he did his own woodcuts. He designed a lot of the diagrams and things like that. And he also, his publishers reused some of the diagrams from other books that they were publishing. So there are astrological figures and planetary figures in there that are, reused from whatever it was they were publishing the month before and were sort of lying around the print shop.
Right.
But, the way that printing worked back then was that it was sponsored by someone. So some nobleman or other who you dedicated the book to, or, you wrote this really nice, flattering letter to them at the front of the book and said, oh, you're very scholarly and very wonderful. And so therefore you have agreed to, help us publish this book. And then, however many copies would be made. And it looks like this was a fairly popular book because when the Italian translators went around and looked for manuscripts, they were able to find, I believe, 108 copies of the first edition lying around, which, if you consider that not all of them would have survived from the actual printing until today, you have to figure that was either a very substantial printing, of about the size that we're doing today, or maybe a little smaller, and people just really loved the book and passed it down and saved it, and it never went, very few copies went out on the back, on the back trash heap.
Right. Well, for me, Bruno has the most detailed, hands-on, stuff to do in all the memory training that I know of from any era, really. But what is it in you what is it in him that resonated so deeply in you? What's the elective affinity, as Goethe might call it, that really spurned you on, besides what you mentioned about having to become the translator because no one else was doing it? What's really the igniting force here?
Yeah, well, I was really interested in the memory technique. I thought that was really fascinating, that it was so dependent on the natural wiring of the human brain to remember places and to remember sort of architectural details, and then also to just formulate memorable images, basing them in emotion. And it also interested me that he's in an interesting place because at the end of the 16th century, right, this is the sort of right before science starts to come to the foreground, and as magic is sort of like, the natural magic is sort of the cool science of the day.
Right.
So people were fascinated in magnets, and they were fascinated with, hypnotism and all these other things. But he was one of these people who sort of read everything, thought about everything, wanted to just completely rework the world, right? Wanted to understand all there was to be understood and to do everything there was to be done, and that was part of the reason why he ran away from his convent in Naples in the first place. I mean, that and the Inquisition was already after him as a young man, but it was also sort of like he wanted to hit the road and see the world. Right. And he'd been educated and he'd studied and he'd, read all of Plato and Aristotle, but, they were like, you should really just stay here and, we have this nice little research facility for you. And he was like, no, I want to experience life, and it's going to be very exciting and all this. So he ends up wandering all over Europe and visiting with all of these, both scholars and with royalty, So he begins in France, gets an advanced degree there, meets with King Henri III, who was a sort of scholar king. He never quite meets Elizabeth, I think, but he sort of circulates around her court.
Right.
And so that whole Shakespearean, that feel of like you want to make poetry that is fit for the queen, and you want to display your erudition and your, skill and your wordplay, right? That's also very present, particularly in these early works that Bruno did, that he sort of edited when he was in the French embassy in London.
Right. Well, there's a lot of threads to follow, but one thing I want to pick up on is this idea of, knowing everything, learning everything. And I was thinking this morning before we got on the call that it's been a short period of time on the one angle since we first discussed Bruno, but it's also been a very long period of time since we first discussed Bruno. And the internet has changed so much, I feel. It almost feels like a different proposition. And yet at the same time, it's still sort of the same thing. So I was wondering, like, how do you feel the internet has changed during this period of time? And then in this context, how true is it that back in Bruno's day, you had a shot at actually reading at least, a substantial amount of everything that was in print, whereas now you'd be hard pressed to make the argument that even 15% of printed material is online, and yet people feel as if they, have access to it all, and it's just this illusion, as if the internet really is a connected thing when it's still in its infancy, but it's getting closer and closer to that, potential of everything connected.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I've been studying this year is the idea of polymaths and Renaissance men and these other related concepts. And one of the things that comes up was that in Bruno's day, it was still possible to have the medieval goal or the medieval quality of being learned. So being learned is literally the past tense of learning. So you have learned what there is to be learned. Right. And you know everything that people expect you to know. So like all of classical literature that, whatever made it up out of Greece and Rome, all of the stuff that had been written since. And it was possible to read, a sizable portion of that, a bit more if you were close to one of the major libraries of Europe, but you could read pretty much everything that was in your language or in Latin, within a human lifetime.
Right.
Now that's absolutely not possible. There are more books that come out in a year than we could ever hope to read, no matter how long we would live.
Right.
But, Bruno had this idea that you should be a humanist, that you should know history and you should know philosophy and be able to be a poet and be able to, write fiction or write a play or, do whatever it is that you needed to turn your hand to. At the same time, I joke that he was basically an adjunct astronomy professor, because that's what he did. Is he taught Sacrobosco's On the Sphere, which was the basic astronomy and astrology text of the day. And so you would apply that to both like foretelling the future, but also, it had applications in medicine, it had applications in navigation and other things. But he was always sort of searching for an academic post or searching for somebody to sponsor his writing or whatever, and it never quite clicked for him. And you have that same feeling for a lot of people who are academics today,
right?
Where it's very hand-to-mouth, it's very temporary, and like you're either in with the leadership of the university, or you're going to be moving on in a year or two.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot I think about, because I went through the academic system, and they say that there's this glut of PhDs, and I think I'm trapped in that. I remember getting the speech from my Dr. Fotter saying, there's not going to be any job for you at the end of this. You could have all the publications under the sun, but it's just not happening. And I told him at that time, well, if that happens, I'll create my own damn university, which is essentially what I did. And it
looks like it's thriving.
Sorry?
Your university is thriving.
Well,
that you've created.
It certainly is. And it's always had this kind of similar influence of, well, if we could learn many, many things, how would we do it? And it needs something that's more robust than the 20th century, 21st century memory competitor books. Not to cast any shade or aspersion on them, but they're not quite this. How are we going to carry entire books in our heads when we can't carry them on our backs? And much credit to you for making a lot of that possible, to see more and more Bruno books in English. Because I think previous to you, the main one that was available in English was on the composition of ideas, which is something I had access to and really got the first taste of just how deep the rabbit hole can go with these techniques. But where I was kind of going with this is, you yourself have, taken on this sort of enterprise in a different way and so forth. And just, that sort of internet difference between 2015 and now, what do you think has stayed the same? What do you think has changed? What are the challenges that are new or have gone away? And what are the new opportunities and the strengths of this, given that we're like him in some sense, that we're kept at some sort of length from the traditional university? And perhaps, we don't know, but it's probably a gift that we're out more than anything, because we're free to do things as we please without too much control.
I think it's become a lot harder to have sort of that. In the early days of the internet, everything sort of felt like people were making cars in their garages.
Right.
Everything was a small website. Everything was, and there was always something that was new. And now that side of the internet has scaled up to the point where you're not going to replace Facebook or Twitter or Google or any of those anytime soon. But on the upside, I think it's become a lot easier to build virtual businesses that come off of the internet and into the real world. So publication, the availability of publishing resources is fantastic.
Right.
I think likewise, I just got one of the new iPhones, and you could literally shoot a movie from start to finish, edit it within the phone, and do the whole thing with no other equipment than what you can hold in your hand.
Right.
And that capacity to undertake creative projects and to, the technology that facilitates that is extremely powerful and extremely good. Right. So to the extent that you can now, create professional looking video and all of this and do everything that anyone else can do. And then the other thing, the nice thing about COVID has been that even the professional video now is shot in someone's home, right?
Right.
So you get to see on the news commentary, instead of them having to drive into New York or Washington, D.C. for a 5-minute segment, right? They're now sitting in front of, a bookshelf like the one behind you,
Right.
or, or the room behind me. And so there's a certain charm to that, and there's a certain feeling that you've done away with something that was just sort of unnecessary.
Right.
Right. And so, I hope that it will continue, that people will be working from home, will be, working in an environment that they enjoy and that they're comfortable with. So I think if that continues, that's good. I think that, the quality of, handmade 1-person, 2-person projects, it can only continue to increase. And I think that's all of the good as well.
Right.
So if you have something to say, you have a way to say it.
And now that you mention it, you're right. Like the mise en scène has become much more at home based in even just commercials and so forth. So that's interesting. And it makes me think, as I understand some of the things that Bruno is going on about, there is this kind of dissolution of separation from my consciousness and your consciousness, not necessarily in Shadows, which is the current Kickstarter that you have on, although those signs are there with the intentions and the conceptions. But he seems to really switch it on in Seal of Seals, for example, which has got this sort of self-help component, which is, I read it as just dissolving this differences between the illusion that there's separateness between this consciousness and that consciousness, or even this material and that material, which maybe gets a bit into the cosmological. But I wonder just what your general thoughts are about that, and then what the implications of this internet stuff is in terms of really binding us all together and removing that separation. Because it seems to me like that may be the implications and the ultimate place that it goes. But right now we're almost in an inquisition again. Like I think a lot about Bruno because people are being, kicked off of this platform and that platform because they said words, which is kind of a symbolic burning in some sense. So threw a lot out there, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think one of the things that he does is he's very psychologically based. So he's dealing with kind of a proto-psychology that's transitional between, the idea of character, that you'll see in, for example, Shakespeare's plays, or in, works that are earlier than that, and the full psychological, underpinning that you get by the 19th century, where Freud is starting up, turn of the 20th century, where you're really going into depth psychology. Here is this concept, which you can also find in people like Paracelsus, of an internal landscape and an internal firmament of stars, but also of personality, of influences, of memory, and of imagery, right? So that was one of the things that drew me to him. And you're right, in 30 Seals, it's much more explicit. I think one of the big influences on that book is Nicholas of Cusa, who talked about the idea of creation as unfolding from God and unfolding back into God. So there's this kind of non-dual aspect of it.
Right?
And also who talked about the idea of contraction of opposites. So, and Bruno goes into various other kinds of contraction in there, but that collapse of separation between me and you, between, what's here and what's there, between now and then, between any kind of opposite whatsoever. Right. And so you find inner unity and inner harmony, even between things which are apparently quite different. Right. In the Theses on Magic, he talks about how all emotions actually reduce to love, So even hate, right? The reason you hate someone is because they threaten something that you love or someone that you love, right? And so even the emotion of hate, which seems very opposite to love, is actually born out of love. And so you end up with this kind of, right, love makes the world go round, right? Peace, love, and joy. And so, right, it's a very positive message, and it's not necessarily one you would expect from him because he was a fairly contentious person, right, in his real life. But at the same time, like, as they said, Kepler had a rough life, but he wrote the book On the Harmony of the World, right? Because despite the apparent difficulty and apparent tumult of events, what you actually have is a world that is well organized and that is interconnected, right? And where we are all related to one another.
Right. Well, on that theme, if I understand correctly, you're also working on a meditation initiative. And to what extent do you see, the memory wheel stuff as, useful for yourself? Do you practice it at all, having a memory wheel and, rotating it to help come up with ideas to solve problems, or otherwise have contemplation in your meditation? Or to what extent do you just do your own thing or follow different schools, or how does that all play out?
What's interesting, I do have memory palaces. A lot of them are, simple narrative, one layer palaces, but also I just have a lot of kind of architectural memory of things. So, I collect buildings in my head and use them to store critical memories. And then I do also work through a lot of problems visually and try to, rotate images of machinery or of molecules or different things in my head and use that memory technology for other things than just recalling. So I'm, actually working through manipulating it and seeing how it is. And weirdly, like it started to creep into my dreams. So a lot of my memory palaces show up, while I'm asleep.
Right. Well, that must be a wonderful thing indeed. Have you?
It is.
Have you found a benefit from them showing up, or do you get extra practice, or is it just they're there and not necessarily being rehearsed?
Well, I think it's helped improve the vividness of my dreams and the stability of them. I also do, as you said, other kinds of meditation, one of which is dream yoga.
Right.
And so all of that interlinks. And so the dream yoga helps the memory palaces and the waking visualizations to become stronger and vice versa.
Right. So what is dream yoga in your practice?
So dream yoga it's a couple of things. So one, it is becoming aware when you are dreaming. So lucid dreaming.
Right.
And you say, you either set a trigger or you just set a mantra and say, I'm dreaming right now. Right. And one of the tricks to that is that it helps if you also tell yourself that you're dreaming while you're awake and behave as though your waking life is a dream.
Right.
And so, which helps as well with like emotional reactivity. So, things don't upset you terribly much because, you notice the dreamlike character of, even difficult situations. Someone cuts you off in traffic. You're like, well, that's just something that happened. That doesn't have any like emotional resonance or, any sort of meaning in my life. It's just, that something is going to happen. And if that doesn't happen, then something else will. And if you wait half a second, something again will happen.
Right.
So you just let it all flow past.
Yeah, I mean, that reminds me of, the idea, this image we have of Bruno as ornery, stubborn, all that sort of stuff. I mean, we're getting that partly from his own text because he's got this kind of attitude to his students and so forth. But it seems to me that, there's so much conditioning and maybe genetic component to how an individual is. And a lot of the meditation would not only be, well, at least for me, it is, not just not getting annoyed by traffic or whatever, but not even just not getting annoyed by myself, because I just sort of watch this meat tube playing out this program and dreaming, not dreaming, whatever. It's just like, I don't even get irritated at the dude I think that I am. Do you have that sort of distance as well, or is it more external?
I think it's a little of both. I had a really interesting dream last night, or I don't know that it was interesting, but it was very on point. Right. In that I dreamed that I was in a sort of like a relic shop or an antique shop run by one of my meditation teachers. And, and she said, oh, go clean up this part of the shop, or go clean the bathroom or something. And so I did that. And, and she says, and go over here and sweep the carpets or whatever it is. So I did that. And then at the end, she says, okay, well, you've done a lot of work here. So she says, here, take one of these with you. And she puts an enormous bagel covered with what looks like cream cheese on the table. And she says, this is an everything bagel. Would you like some of it? And so I tasted some of it. And then I sort of turned it around and tasted a different bit. And I said, oh, wow, this part tastes really great here. This is like, honey and it's very sweet and everything. And this part tastes like horseradish. And this other part, tastes like something horrible, like pus or blood or something. And she says, oh, and I said, well, why does it taste different? And she said, she sort of crooked her head at me and she said, that's because it's an everything bagel. She says, you like this part and you don't like that part. And you're excited by that and you're bored by that. She says, oh, and she says, it's an everything bagel. When everything tastes like everything, then you'll be done meditating.
Right. Yeah, that's great.
And at that point I woke up laughing. So but I was like, either that was really like, too close to home when somebody says something like that.
Right. Oh, that's amazing. And, to bring it back to Bruno, this reminds me of one of my central ideas about the memory techniques that I think is heavily influenced by him. So it's like a channeling or something like this, which is essentially that all information, and I think of him as a sort of information theorist, all information is fundamentally the same. And the gematria, or the arrangement of letters, either in a wheel or connected with Mary palaces or with figures or statues or whatever, is a way of equalizing information so that, maybe it doesn't taste the same, but if you had to memorize something from astronomy, you would be able to treat it as if it was the same as something from biology or something from, just someone's name that you had to memorize, right? So, do you have that same sort of impression? I see the technology as a great equalizer of information, so that even if it isn't the same in appearance, you treat it in reality as if it's the same.
Sure. And, as with the everything bagel, when you're dealing with it as everything, every part of the bagel, right? Then you're getting the full flavor. You're getting all of the experience, all the time, wide open. And there it is, and that's sort of where you're trying to get, is just to let that happen.
Right.
And you can kind of sit there, right, and just take it in.
So speaking of taking things in and letting things emerge, and the universe unfolding and folding back into itself, and all these rich, wonderful ideas, what's your take on a goal that Bruno had, if he had one goal or, multiple goals that he may have had? What sort of your feeling that he was gunning for in terms of, anybody being able to take that teaching and say, especially in shadows, like, aha, I've got it. I've arrived at this thing that I'm supposed to be learning from this book?
Well, there are sort of two levels to that. So with De Umbra Sidierum itself, I think he was trying to make a sort of jewel box that would excite someone to develop their own capacity for memory, for discovery, for organizing things, for, producing and creating new things. In a larger sense, I think he really, really wanted to create a totally new philosophy, from soup to nuts.
Right.
And so he, like, the fact that he worked on memory and he worked on cosmology and on magic and logic and all of these other, and on ethics and on, right, and wrote plays and wrote poetry and did all this stuff. It was designed to be a comprehensive system. And that was sort of what fascinated him, was this perspective that he had. So, for example, his idea of the infinite universe, right? He was sort of fascinated and involved in that, like, limitless unfolding of this complex system. And he thought of that in every way possible. So, whether that was in your own life or whether that was the world as a whole.
Right. Yeah. I think an interesting angle, I think it's Martin Fox has suggested that word memory was actually meant not just things you remember, but actually things you create, like imagination, or whatnot. But I wonder to what extent, you think that humans are creating things, or where creation stands, because so much of it seems to me a surrender to that unfolding and folding back into itself without your sort of fantasy that you're somehow in control of this. And yet there's always this paradox that if you don't interact with it through acts of will, you can't possibly progress, the notion of the chain, or, ascension on a ladder from darkness up to light and so forth. So that seems to me this huge paradox. And I wonder your thoughts on it and how you resolve it, if possible. This idea of, you're not in control of anything, and yet you have to have acts of control in order to be able to surrender.
Yeah, I think it's very clear in another Renaissance figure, Pico della Mirandola, who sort of says, well, humans are the only ones who could be, they could live like an animal or they could live like an angel, right? And it's their choice, or they can live like both. And they could, be fully human, experience the full range from top to bottom. Human beings can be utterly terrible and do things so wicked that no animal would do them, right? So they're worse than animals, right? They're like demons. And then also are so wonderful that they do things that just astonish you, right? But the point is that they participate. I think that's the verb that you have to come up with, is participate in every part of creation. So, when I say you sort of bathe in and just live in this in the field of the senses, you're also participating in it. It's an interactive thing,
right?
And there's no finish line and no starting line. So it's always this, living system that you're part of, and it doesn't stop at your skin. It doesn't either in or out.
Right.
You are part of the system.
Yeah, that's super interesting, especially when we think about, the reflection of all the stars in the self and so forth. To what extent do you think that this explanation, all the explanations we come up with, like, oh, well, we're part of the system, or, humans are the only thing that can be both animal and angel and so forth. Like the first thing that comes to my mind, yeah, but what about Old Yeller? I mean, Old Yeller was a dog that could participate in the family in very intentional ways. Dogs have intelligence, etc. Yet he gets rabies and he becomes the most destructive creature whatsoever. And the difference is that, the true difference is that we don't know what's in the mind of a dog, but I also don't know, if I'm honest, what's in your mind, etc. Right? So everything is sort of just appearing in this screen with no real way to confirm that there is anything outside of this, which is the problem of hard solipsism. I'm just sort of throwing stuff out there, but it really is one of the most interesting things that I'm preoccupied with. And I wonder what your thoughts are, what's in Bruno about that you've encountered, and so on.
I just don't believe in hard solipsism.
Right.
I think, I don't have the feeling that that Wittgenstein or some other people had, that, right, that you're seeing the world through this little pipeline and can't even accurately describe what's going on in your own head. I think there's a philosopher of mind called Thomas Nagel, who wrote a famous paper that says, I do not know what it is like to be a bat, right? And I think that's wrong. I think you know what it's like. I don't think you know what it is to be a bat.
Right.
Right. But you can know what it's like. You can make inferences about what it is to be a bat from the bat's behavior, from having a theory of mind about the bat. That may or may not be perfectly accurate, probably isn't, but it's not as though there is no access, right? We talk about the conscious and unconscious mind, right? But really, it's levels of access. So you think about the autonomic nervous system. You have no access into how fast your heart is going to beat, or very little, right? More into how your lungs are going to breathe, but you do have some access to both, right? It's not perfect. You aren't always in perfect control of it, but you have some degree of access or influence, right? And so this idea that there is no access beyond, your own locked-in brain, just it has no appeal. Right.
Yeah, that's interesting. One of the things that makes me think of, I don't know if it's the same Nagel that I'm thinking of, who writes a lot about Spinoza and has a couple books about Spinoza. Is that the same guy?
Yeah, I think.
If it is the same guy, the Spinoza response and how he talks about Spinoza is almost the opposite of you can't think like a bat, because the Spinoza proposition is that the meat tube is like a receptacle through which information passes. And even in ethics, Spinoza kind of gestures at this idea that you don't have to worry about dying, because all information that passes through you is the life of the previous generation, and so too will the information pass through others. So it's kind of like saying, yes, you can't imagine that thing. And this gets to the problem of suffering, where people say, oh, I wish I was like so-and-so, or I wish that I had this Instagrammer's life or whatever. Well, you do. You have the perfect representation already in your mind. So now go be what you are, because you already have all the access you're ever going to get to that sort of thing. But no question coming out of that, but rather it just seems to me that it's sort of irrelevant whether hard solipsism, soft solipsism exists or not. There's rather just this now that we have access to at all times, in which memory is a figure, and the fitness of your memory kind of conditions the pleasure of your experience or the lack of it.
Yeah.
That easy. Problem solved. Well, on technical notes, since that I've been talking about memory wheels and done some stuff sort of trying to work through my own understanding and understand by doing and thinking and expressing what I'm thinking about it, a lot of people have come back to me and said, well, I'm trying to use the memory wheel as a memory palace. And I just don't see that was the purpose of it. Although it is spatial, and it certainly can be mentally navigated as you would a memory palace. Do you have the feeling that Bruno would have used that as a memory palace, or is it a thought device of ars combinatoria?
Okay, so yeah, I think it has, like, all of these memory technologies that he developed seem to have multiple applications. So if you think of the requirements of a memory palace, it's that you have a bunch of images that are the locations themselves, and you have some kind of order to it, some kind of shape. And so if you think of over in the seals, right, there's the idea of the field, which is basically a Cartesian grid, right? Or the sky or the heavens, which is basically you look up and you make up constellations. Then there's no reason why you can't use the alphabet either as a line or in a circle to represent a memory palace.
Right.
And, I was actually just watching one of Martin Falks's videos on this topic, and he sort of points out, like, if you have the wheel that's the wheel of A, where you have it's just the letters themselves, and you come up with, A for Adam's apple, right? Is like, that's an image that you can use, and then not only as a representation of A, but you can also use it as, A is the first location, so number 1, right? And then have a location B, which is you automatically know by the name of the location what number you're on, right? Because you can count your way through the alphabet.
Right.
And we had talked before about using movies or plays in the same way, but like, what could be simpler? Like, your alphabet. Everyone knows their alphabet. So
Hopefully.
Why not have it be, right? It's perfectly easy, perfectly simple. And all you have to do is make sure you know how to represent the place itself versus the thing that you put in the place.
Right.
And, you can confuse the images and you could do other things with them. But it seems reasonable to me that you could use it that way. You can also use it as as Ramon Lowell did it, right? Where he's using each of those as an argument and you combine those with other arguments or entities or whatever it is, and make judgments about it and divine, what you really think about something, right? Whether you know something, understand it, and like it, or whether you just know and understand it but don't like it, or understand and like it but don't know for sure. Like, you can imagine something that you wouldn't know, but you understand what you don't know. And if it were so, you would like that fact, right? And so you can have these combinations of things that are, logical propositions in combination, and in combinations that you normally wouldn't think of them being in, and you can come up with new ideas off of that.
Right.
And you can also go back and forth between, right, a letter and an image and a concept, right? And so if you look at a painting of, 3 nudes descending a staircase, right, and you translate those into whatever it is that you represent a nude woman and a staircase are in your, right, logical proposition, and you go, what does that mean? And maybe you say, oh, that meaning is something that solves a question that I had about a totally unrelated area, or like how to build an internal combustion engine using wood.
Right.
It could be anything. And so, there are a lot of neat technologies and ways to use the technology that, I haven't even thought of. And that Bruno doesn't actually outright suggest, but when you start thinking in terms of what can be the foreground, what can be the background, what is the system about, how can we apply the system, and then you add in all of Lowell's technologies for questioning and deciding and thinking about different things, you have this immensely powerful toolbox that you can fit for whatever needs you may have.
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting thing because it's an example of a constraint that is very, very productive. And I mean, Bruno says a couple of times throughout the works that you've translated, I've seen it maybe at least 3 times, where he just says, if you think about this long and hard enough, you will come to the same conclusion that I have about this. And yet, as you pointed out, there's new things to arrive out of it. And we know we have all the evidence in the world that new things have arrived out of it, because 30 years of memory competitions, they've gotten memorizing a deck of cards down to like 12 seconds, and they're just constantly exceeding what was possible year after year after year. So obviously there's new ways of approaching it. Now they're all sort of linked to the same constraints, but they're reconfigured in these new ways. So it's just that wonderful example of ancient things constantly becoming new. And they are also new in every mind that has never encountered them before. So there's that angle as well. So when you come to it fresh, you misinterpret it and then it winds up working anyway, and that sort of thing. So it's a beautiful art, all in all.
Mm-hmm. I'm always sort of impressed, and I always think of just like simple applications of it, like the kids over in India and South Asia who are trained on abacuses.
Right.
And after a while, they don't even need the abacus to be there. They just sort of look up into the air, visualize an abacus, and move it around, right? And are able to work math with it. Right. And that's a memory palace technique.
Mm-hmm.
Right, is you've got this little instrument, right? Again, it's like the seals, right? It's just this little miniature palace that, has so many registers in it. And you can just look at that and you go, okay, like geometrically or visually speaking, here's the number that results from this huge multiplication that I just did.
Right.
And it's just, there's always something new, and people are coming up with remarkable things out of it.
Well, speaking of new, let's talk about the Kickstarter campaign. You have this, first of all, you're revising the text, right? And so what's involved in that process? What's going to be different from versions that people may already have?
So there are a couple of things. One is that, like I said, I was teaching myself Latin at the time that I did it, and Bruno's Latin is famously elaborate and kind of, he has some twists and turns in it. And so I'm sure there are many mistakes and many shortcomings in the thing and many awkward phrases in it. And so part of the revision is just cleaning all of that up a little bit,
right?
At least to the best of my ability, especially because, the first time I didn't have an editor, I didn't have, someone who spoke Latin better than I did looking over my shoulder and going, oh, you can't decline that verb like that.
Right.
And so that's all being cleaned up. And then the second piece is that some people had asked me to add in some more references and more supporting material so that the text would be a little more rich and a little more carefully annotated.
Right.
And so that's the other big thing.
Right. Yeah, that's very useful. I mean, having other references, other, sort of angles, ways to look at what a line, how a line scans, etc., can be tremendously useful. In terms of the Kickstarter itself, you've got a number of, these sort of boosters that are quite common and traditional on Kickstarter campaigns. So one of them is, various additional editions of the text itself, but then there's also a course. So tell us a little bit about the course that you have in mind planned for us.
Well, I was inspired by you, and not to gild the lily, but like one of the things that Bruno's original students had said was, this Diumbra Sidierum, this is really complicated. And, can you explain it more easily so we can get started in the thing? And sure enough, even today, it's there, like we said, there's a lot in it. There are a lot of applications that you could have. And so I want to both, explain the text, partially as you did, by reading through it, but also partially in providing, the learnings of modern psychology and neuroscience to kind of give you some foundation there, but also to say, okay, here's what he really meant. Here are some ways that you can use it. Here's how you can build your own memory palace.
Right.
Fairly easily.
Yeah, it is a tricky text. I mean, I really think that I only started to switch on when I reread all your translations, because Song of Circe came out, and I think that was the one you said was the last that you were going to do. And so then I reread through all that I had, and it just so happened that I had sort of come to a plateau, let's say, or a milestone with studying Advaita Vedanta. And then I just could see things in it that I'd never seen before. Before, I was just seeing technical things about, memory palaces and different ways of creating your images and, all kinds of technical things. But now I saw the actual outcome and what exactly these conceptions and intentions were all about. I think I did anyway, at a much deeper level and in a way that actually connected and made sense to me as something, oh yeah, this totally makes sense. But for people who are kind of stuck on this, what would you, in addition to obviously supporting your Kickstarter campaign so they can join you on the course, what would you say is the sort of number one way that you would better come to grips with this particular teaching and the difficulty in this text?
I think you have to see that he's presenting you with a number of ways to lay out a memory palace, one or another of which is going to seem particularly congenial for you. Or you may decide, this is all really over my head right now, and I'm going to come back to it. And then if you do the work on your own, and just build simple one room, 10 items or so memory palaces from places that then you can sort of work and gradually scale up and treat the stuff on the Shadows of Ideas as being a potential. So you say, okay, look, I understand how to remember my laundry list or my grocery list, right? Or what I'm going to say when I get up to give a 5-minute speech.
Right.
And that's a perfectly valid capability, but you can also say, I know it's possible if I use the more advanced techniques or the more extensive techniques to remember, everything I want to remember. I can remember a whole book if I need to, right? And I know Jonathan Foer, or Joshua Foer, one of the Foer brothers, memorized a dictionary because he was going into a part of Africa where they only spoke a particular native language, and he had, like the French to this language dictionary. And so he's like, I won't be able to carry that with me or like leaf through it desperately while I'm in the middle of the jungle talking to these people. So he's like, I had to use a memory palace to memorize that, get all of that information down, and then go from there. So it's all about what you want to do with it, and whatever you want to do with it, you will be able to do with it. Right.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that people struggle with the most is having a meaningful goal. They're not always sure, and I'm really quite glad that I finally, started to switch on to what Shadows is really all about, because it is possibly the highest goal that you could have, which is to use these kinds of techniques to solve life's issues, or at least have some sort of strategy that can help navigate the rough seas of the world.
Right.
So you go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that's really one of the most powerful applications of it. In one sense, there's the saying that, an educated man is never poor because he has the wealth of all that knowledge within him. And so, the images and the things that you remember are a kind of portable wealth for you. Right. And they can, if you have a rich memory, both of like virtuous things or of beautiful things, right? So you remember clearly when you saw the Mona Lisa with your own eyes, right, in the Louvre or whatever it is, right? Or you saw the Statue of Liberty, or you saw whatever it was that you experienced. If you can use this and then take the vibrancy and the stability and the clarity that you get using this to apply to your own memories of the people in your life, right? Then they carry on with you. right?
Yeah, that's a beautiful thing. I mean, being more connected to your own personal history, is obviously going to be very, very edifying, especially when you focus on the positive aspects of it, like being able to see something as amazing as the Statue of Liberty or Mona Lisa. Although my memory, it was almost like a flashbulb memory when you said Mona Lisa, because the first time I saw Mona Lisa was through, I don't know, 100 cell phones that were all trying to take a picture of the Mona Lisa. So I'm not sure I ever did see it.
But that's also a remarkable image, isn't it?
It is.
Like looking at 100 cell phone screens illuminated, right? You could see that as a separate work of art of its own.
It is.
So, we live in the age of reproduction, right? So it's not enough that you should have to see the Mona Lisa, but you have to record that you've seen the Mona Lisa. And it's not even good enough that you have a copy of the Mona Lisa that you bought in the gift shop, right? But that you must have the copy of it, which is electronic and that you have on your own phone, right? That you will probably never, ever look at because all it is a picture of other people taking the picture of Mona Lisa on their cell phones. And instead of appreciating the fact that it's Mona Lisa with 100 copies of Mona Lisa in light around it, which, if you think about it, is an aesthetically beautiful image, right? You think, who are all of these damn people with their cell phones, like me, getting in my way?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Right? You don't notice that you are the criminal that you are, trying to shoo away.
Right. So that's your time to say, this is like something in a dream.
Yes.
Right. This is this, and just sort of admire the spectacle of it.
Right.
And let it happen. Let it arise and relax and let it go away.
Yeah. Well, and since you mentioned the age of mechanical reproduction, I mean, I think that's probably a reference to Benjamin, and he would point out this kind of ritualistic aspect to it. So there's also the symbolic gesture of going to see the Mona Lisa in the first place. Which, what I really love about this project, reviving your original translation and so forth, is that this creates an opportunity to both ritualistically, participate in the transactional event of supporting a project, but also transcending that and actually going deeper into the text and revisiting the text if you've already read it, having a course and deeply engaging with it in that actual non-ritualistic sense, where you're going to have mechanics, that steps you can follow that are embodied because you actually do it, which then returns you to ritual, which is the ritual of, sort of using the techniques themselves. So I'm grateful you're doing it. And I was very, very excited to see the launch of the project.
Well, good. I hope you enjoy the course when it happens.
Oh, I'm sure I will. And I hope a lot of people are going to take this opportunity, because it is, not to put on the whatever you call it, the script, but it is time limited, as these things are. So hopefully people will, be able to attend that. Or do you have plans to make it available under separate cover in the future? Obviously.
Yeah, it'll be under separate cover. It's looking like it will be, much more expensive to get it on its own than by simply picking up one of the hardback editions.
Right.
So really the kind of added value is, larger than the actual cost of the physical object.
Right.
So hopefully, that will provide some additional, impetus to buying the thing, which is it's only going to be offered together during the Kickstarter.
Right.
But if you would rather just have the course and do that, that's fine. If you are happy with the paperback book or the ebook, I purposefully made those really, really inexpensive so that as many people as possible would be able to take advantage of them. And likewise, if these interactions that we have, if people benefit from those, that's wonderful, and hopefully it costs them nothing.
As long as they have the devices needed to run them, it is free minus time, attention, focus, and all that stuff, which is always a blessing to speak. But by way of winding down, over these years, what would you say, if anything, has been the most surprising aspect of the Bruno project that you weren't expecting?
It's very strange now. I'm associated with him, like that I'm recognized as one of the Bruno guys,
right?
And in sort of strange contexts, because like people will see my name and they'll say, "Now, where have I seen that before?" And they'll, "Oh, I read the book, right? I read this particular book," and and then they'll relate a story about how they came to be interested in Bruno, and and it's all sorts of people. You get it in the doctor's office, and on online conferences, on through the meditation thing. But yeah, it's been interesting. People go, "Oh yes, that," right? And Bruno is one of these people who his name shows up like once in all of these different areas of study, or there'll be one reference to him in a huge book with hundreds of names in it, but like Bruno will show up there, like in the space program, or in whatever it is, medicine, or law, or something like that, and Bruno will show up and sort of like just peek around the corner, and and there he is. So that's been kind of a fascinating thing, and and having been involved with this for a while now, like I'm hypersensitive to, I'm like, oh, there's the appearance right there, and I see him everywhere, just a little bit.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I was rereading Nietzsche, and I was like, damn, he's even in Nietzsche. Neil deGrasse Tyson, Nietzsche, he's everywhere.
Yep.
Well,
Nietzsche has him because Hegel had him, and Hegel had him because Leibniz had him.
Right. Well, I can't really quite tell if Nietzsche's joking or he's being serious, but he seems to. Oh, and if you think that Bruno was correct about this, then blah blah blah, the usual Nietzsche shtick. But Nietzsche had a love-hate relationship for just about everybody that he mentioned, so I'm sure it was also a very respectful name dropping at the same time. But yeah, it's been great to catch up, and just again very grateful for what you've enabled in all these translations, and excited that you're taking it to the next level, especially given the possibilities we have in this publishing era where everything is in beta except for when it isn't. And that's one of the cool things about making this print edition, is that it's got that substantial, real, and unchanging aspect to it, insofar as books last as a material object. It does have stability, as you've shown in that picture you have of the edition of Bruno that you have, which is incredible to see.
Well, hopefully this will outlive me. So,
right.
Yeah. So I look forward to, talking to you always, and I'm grateful for all the support you've given me over the years, and, for all the work that you do in helping people develop stronger memories and use their memories in unexpected ways. So it's been good.
Yes. Thanks for being part of it.
Take care.
Cool. Thank you. And we'll talk soon. Well, I want to thank Scott for his time on this interview, for all his ideas, and of course, his wonderful translations and all the incredible amount of hard work and time and effort and energy that went into them. Now, don't forget, when you support Scott's campaign, you can get all of his translations in addition to the hardback of De Umbricidarum, along with access to the online course. You can search for the project on Kickstarter, or simply use the link magneticmarymethod.com/SG. SG is for Scott Gosnell, in case it wasn't painfully obvious, and we thank him again for his powerful contributions to the art, the science, and the history of our beautiful memory tradition.